I think it's a good time to start.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
let me do the introduction for you.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So because I'm using my laptop, so it will be, I don't think that my microphone really needed.
Okay,
So
yeah.
yeah, thank you everyone for coming. For those, also we have like about 30 people online and 6 people in person. So with great pleasure, we have our guest, Simon Bowring from France Academy of Science, and he's expert in fire, also the geoscience background, and he has working on the modeling of global surface carbon cycle, especially those related to the wildland fire. So I think he will talk a little bit about how he's model the fire and the soil combustion and how to quantify the carbon emission to help the IPCC to reform their policy, something like that. Welcome. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Also check if people online can hear us clearly. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, just ignore that. We let
Okay.
people.
I just Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Huang, for the invitation. Yeah, so I'm Simon, and at the LSCE, where we basically try to quantify the carbon cycle at a global scale. And I work primarily with a global land surface model, which is part of an overall Earth system model, which is called IPSR. So today I'm just going to talk a bit about how we model fire and soil and potential modeling of fire in the soil at global scale. So just some brief introduction. As most of you know, CO2 emissions and atmospheric CO2 concentrations have been increasing over time. And the future global temperatures that will result from that span a range that you can see in this figure, with the most extreme scenario suggesting that by 2050, we will have an increase of around 2 degrees Celsius over the pre-industrial temperature. Now, the global carbon cycle is important, as you know, because it regulates many things, including temperature, but it's also the denominator basically of life, and life is what mediates the global carbon cycle and keeps carbon out of the atmosphere. So in this figure, you can basically see that all the different stocks, the sort of sinks, if you will, of carbon over the globe. Well, and when I talk about sink, there's a lot of vocabulary that may not always be used by some of the listeners. So a sink, I mean, it's a sort of a part of the Earth's processes in which carbon uptake exceeds carbon loss over medium to long-term timescales. So you can see, for example, that in the atmosphere, there's around 875 gigatons of carbon, whereas in the ocean, the biggest store of it is actually in dissolved carbonic form, the acid, basically, of 37,000 gigatons. So why is the carbon cycle important? This is just some background again. So at the moment, the Earth's global mean surface temperature is about 15 degrees Celsius, with about, let's move that because I can't remember this. Yeah, it's about 420 parts per million. And basically, over the last 500 million years, the Earth's temperature has oscillated largely in line with its atmospheric CO2 concentration, which has obviously been increasing since the Industrial Revolution of about 280 parts per million to today's roughly 420 parts per million. And in this paper that I just showed that contained this figure, they estimate based on the long-term geological relation of CO2 with temperature that actually the Earth system sensitivity, that is the sensitivity of the Earth's temperature to doubling of CO2, is actually around 8 degrees Celsius, which is significantly higher than estimated currently by models, which is worrying because it means that we don't, well, either this is wrong or it means we don't include enough feedbacks in our modeling efforts. Yeah, and so this is important, obviously, because, well, if the temperature heats up, then a lot of life is not capable of surviving shocks in terms of climate. And indeed, whereas all the previous mass extinctions on Earth occurred due to phenomena that arose outside of the critical zone of the Earth, that is the surface of the Earth, so asteroids, mantle movement and outgassing and so on. Today's potential mass extinction comes from its Earth's surface. So the shocks from within its own system may be unparalleled over the last 500 million years. So atmospheric CO2 concentrations depend on the planetary carbon sinks. So it's not just the atmosphere, obviously. We have fossil fuel emissions, which increase over time, as you can see on the left. And there's a growth rate. But the growth rate, as you can see, doesn't track with the emissions as such, because there are other sinks in the carbon cycle, which are the land and the ocean. And as you can see, the ocean is very stable over time, generally, and it's the land that oscillates and is quite volatile because it's highly responsive to changes in climate and various other things, fire and so on, as we will see shortly. Finally, there's huge spatial variability in all of these factors. So, fossil fuel emissions are spatially, they occur in places where there's industrial activity. Land use emissions, such as deforestation, occur largely in places with lots of trees or lots of cropland. And the oceans, sinks and sources depend mostly on circulation. So at present, basically, the land sink is a bit under threat, which you can see at the bottom left figure there. For 2023, the light green bit of the bar there is the land carbon sink, and it's very small in 2023, basically because there's a lot of drought, there's a lot of fire in Canada. Basically, so the sink was weakened, and it shows that actually over time there's a potential for the land sink to actually become a source if conditions are extremely unfavorable for vegetation growth on the land surface. So this is why we build global models of Earth system processes, because we want to understand the impacts of humanity's actions for the future of life on Earth, essentially. And so we build these models, and they make sort of predictions of what happens, when we increase emissions. And this is just to show you that, there are many, many different models from many different countries, and, they don't have the same outputs. But in yellow there is the model that we developed, which is the IPSL Earth system model. So what are Earth system models? They are, they have many different compartments. So for ours, for example, in the IPSL model, we have an ocean side and a sort of land and atmosphere side. So you have, for the ocean, you have sea ice model, which is separate, a biogeochemistry model, which is separate, an ocean circulation model, which is separate, an atmospheric model, a land model, and a chemistry and aerosol model. And so all these things interact with each other at sort of vertical and lateral grids in 3D space.
May I just interrupt a little bit, because this is using my name, so so sorry. It's best to not.
I'm just going to keep talking.
Yes, go ahead.
So yeah, basically these models are sort of stuck together with a sort of high level architecture that binds them on big supercomputers and are run in parallel and so on. But they're generally coarse resolution at sort of 0.1 to 0.5 degrees, which is equivalent to about 100 to 2,500 square kilometer grid cells. So this is quite different to maybe what many of you will be used to working with. And quickly on models and modelers. So, many people have a big problem with models and modelers because we kind of tend to simplify everything and, parameterize and do all these kinds of things, which it's completely correct. I won't read these quotes, but it's only to say that, you know, there's no point believing in models. Models are really just tools. They can be very powerful, but they are entirely dependent on the ability of the person building or using them to interpret them for their faults and strengths. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, they're sort of parables, I would say. And models are a continuous set of parables, and we should not just believe a model because it says something. But you know, a model should give you sort of a mirror of reality based on what you understand about reality, which means you have to also do the groundwork to understand what reality is, you know, observationally. I'm just going to skip some slides here. Yeah. So on fire models, finally, why do we model fires at global scale? Well, firstly, because they are an important feedback potentially to the climate and to atmospheric CO2, as we saw earlier in last year. The fires in Canada were very large. They were almost an order of magnitude higher than the average for that region, as you can see in this figure in the middle. And in fact, the emissions that came out of those fires alone was equivalent to almost the entire emissions of India, which is obviously a country of a billion plus people. So, you know, fires are pretty significant and have a pretty large impact on the carbon cycle. So, having said that, you know, fires have always existed. They're very important for a large suite of ecological processes. And, you know, in general, fires haven't led to large increases in atmospheric CO2 over long time scales. And this points mainly to two phenomena, which is that, you know, if you look at this slightly complicated figure, but essentially, you know, as vegetation grows, it gains biomass, and then you get an event like a fire, and then you lose biomass, and then it regrows, and then you lose biomass in the next event. So that generally is called a stable fire regime. And, you know, in this case here, you don't really lose any carbon because it just regrows until the next fire event. But in the case of climate change or climate warming, you know, where it gets warmer and drier and so on, you may get a situation where you have a shorter time between fire events and a change of the sort of biomass regime or the vegetation regime, let's say, and the fire regime, which results in a net loss of terrestrial carbon on the surface. So, yeah, this is a slightly messy diagram, which I made, but it kind of wraps up very simply how we model fires in a global land surface model. So in the IPSL Earth system model, we have the land surface model, which is called Orchidea, and inside Orchidea, there's a fire model, which is called Spitfire. And inside Spitfire, we model fires. So how this works is that in land surface model, you have sort of 10 plant functional types usually, and then there's some crops, but we don't have to speak about them. And these plant functional types come with different rates of photosynthesis and growth and responses to climatic variables, which basically enable sort of growth and death and succession dynamics of vegetation. These dynamics of photosynthesis are then allocated to different pools. So on the sort of bottom left there, you have, say, a tree, and, you know, this photosynthesis will allocate some parts of carbon to leaf or to roots or to sapwood or hardwood. And these components within the fire model then become different classes of fuels. So you have 1, 10, 100, and 1,000 hour, which are just sort of basic kind of classes based on essentially the volume of each piece of fuel. So, you know, a twig will be a 1 hour fuel, and a trunk will be a 1,000 hour fuel. And so you have fuel, and then you have climate that then it generates things like the Nesterov index, which tells you basically how dry it is, and then the interaction of the Nesterov index with the fuel will give you a fire danger index, and then you have ignition. So you have a lightning map that's input. You have a human population density map that's input and changes every year. And there are functions that describe the ignition probability for each of these. And then you generate fire, and then there's sort of explicit fire spread rates, you know, mean individual daily fire size, fire intensity, and then there's a camp meal damage, ground damage, tree mortality, and CO2 emissions that result. Yeah, sorry. I mean, it's a bit more complex than that, obviously, but that's the basic idea. So yeah, although this is, it looks nice. These fire models were originally built to reproduce global burned area, and most global burned area occurs in the African savanna. And so they were basically tuned to reproduce that, which, from a modeling perspective, you can say, well, we get 80% of burned area. That's great. But there's something called the Global Fire Model Intercomparison Project, which the figures I'm showing you now. And if we compare the burned area from the models to sort of the Earth observation-based data sets, for reproducing the seasonal cycle on a grid-by-grid basis, so not on an aggregate scale, but on a grid-by-grid basis, a lot of the models, not so much ours, luckily, but many of the other models are worse than random in generating the seasonal cycles. That's pretty terrible. And the reason is basically that they don't include a lot of processes that are not relevant to, say, savanna fires, because that's what the models were originally built for. They don't include crown fires, they don't include soil burning or anything like that. Yeah, so that's what this slide says. So there's no extreme fires, no explicit soil combustion, and the very poor understanding and representation of combustion completeness, mortality, or recovery. And this is partly to do with fire, the fact that fire is fundamentally driven by things that happen across all kinds of scales imaginable, from teleconnections to very granular sizes, and there's also a lot of stochasticity. But beside that, there's a lot of theoretical behavior that is not included in them yet. And this is important. For example, for extreme fires, there's a lot of dynamics which we would like to represent. So this is just a figure from a recent paper, which shows that in certain biomes, so in the boreal and temperate forests, extreme fires are increasing substantially over the last 20 years, basically. And on the basis just of this year alone, what we've seen in the Amazon and the areas south of it, tropics may be entering this upward trend as well. We also know that in certain biomes, there's a higher probability that extreme fires occur relative to the spatial fraction on the global land surface, which is something also that is not well represented in these models. So yeah, as a kind of aside here, because I will go into the soil side in a second, but for the extreme fires, we now have for Orchidea Spitfire, we have a new model version which tries to represent wind-driven crown fires explicitly, so including all kinds of new representations with the wind-driven rate of spread, topographic rate of spread, species adaptations to fire between different continents, canopy density thresholds, vertical fire breaks, road fragmentation, river fragmentation, water table depths over between years and seasons, and the inclusion of small lakes, which would retard the spread of fires, obviously. And again, just to show that, if you make an effort and actually try to represent things the way we can see them, we can actually get some, these models can actually produce something that makes quite a lot of sense. So, this is the model output from this extreme fire stuff I've been working on. And we can actually get, the seasonal and spatial and intensity distribution of fire in Canada and North America for last year quite well, just on the basis of theory and the climatology and the vegetation. Which I input. So yeah, despite their weaknesses, models can be used to propose new theory as well by hypothesis testing against observed statistical trends. So yeah, this is just something that may be of interest to some of you because I think here you work a bit on wildland urban interface fires. So this is a recent paper we did to try to understand how roads impact on fire propagation because basically roads have been shown to either increase or decrease fire activity depending on conditions and biome, but nobody knew why or exactly how these processes were occurring. So yeah, basically we just decomposed roads at a large grid scale into lots of little circles, and those little circles are like little islands of vegetation. So that's a kind of when you break up vegetation into little parcels, we call it fragmentation. And those fragments are those little circles whose summed perimeter is the total road length of each grid cell. And within each of these little circles, you have different probabilities associated with ignition and spread and fire size that either can retard the fire spread. So the size of the circle here will also limit the fire size inside this grid cell. But it will also, change the probability of an ignition occurring. And, just with some simple hypothesis testing and running this model, we're able to, reproduce global statistical trends of roads with burned area, and also the trends of fragmentation with burned area in, for example, the Amazon here. So this is just whether or not roads increase or decrease fire. So decrease of fire due to fragmentation is blue, and increase of fire due to fragmentation is red. And then we can say something also about how vulnerable then different biomes and different parts of the world are to fires that are generated because of roads and the breakup of land due to human activity. So finally onto soil carbon and fires. Why is soil important? Well, because in the permafrost and in global soils combined, there's something like 4 times as much carbon as there is in the current atmosphere. And a lot of this carbon is, it's very old. So it's sat there for a very long time because it's not easily disturbed. Some of it's, 25, 30, 40,000 years old. And much of this very, very old carbon is in the global boreal region in the Arctic. And the reason it's very old and the reason it's up there is because it's very cold. The season during which the soil is actually not frozen is very, very short, or 0. And or it's waterlogged, basically. So you get peat formation, in which case decomposition is controlled by anaerobic processes, which are much slower in general. So this soil, now focusing on the boreal region, is vulnerable to carbon loss because of temperature. And primarily we think of temperature and carbon loss with respect to soils as something to do with microbial metabolization alone, so just oxidation based on essentially the microbial ecology that exists there. But the losses of carbon to fire are currently unknown or poorly constrained. There are estimates for the last few years, but otherwise for selected regions, but we have no global understanding of it really. Yeah. So an additional complication is that in North America, in the boreal region, the fires tend to be very intense. So there's a lot of crown fire. They move very quickly, they burn a lot of vegetation, but while in Eurasia, they tend to be sort of lower intensity ground fires, which also tend to have quite a larger impact on the soil. So basically, whereas in North America, you can sort of expect much higher emissions and vegetation loss due to extreme or fast-moving fire, you might expect more soil carbon loss in Eurasia because there's these kind of slow-moving ground fires. And this is already kind of happening. So there's, at least in Siberia, for example, which you can see on the left, the decadal increase in temperature is already sort of 2 degrees per decade, which is on the basically on trend with the highest emission scenario and highest response scenario from the IPCC reporting. So worst case, essentially, while fires in Siberian Arctic are increasing substantially. in the last 20 years alone, and this comes with increased burning of peatlands. In addition, with the burning of peatland and the burning of soils in these areas, there's a lot of smoldering fire, which is something of interest, I think, here. And this is increasing over time. And the interesting thing about the smoldering fires is that, you know, they can carry on over winter and reignite essentially overlying vegetation when it sort of when the growing season begins again the following year, and sort of cause new fires, at least in the Arctic. So what does this mean for emissions? Well, at least for North America, it's now been estimated with some degree of robustness that around 90% of all carbon emissions from fires come actually from the soil and not from the vegetation, which you can see in this figure, where basically the solid bars are the below ground emissions, and the lighter shading is the above ground emissions from fires. And for modeling, this is important because, because the modeled estimates of emissions from these regions is very, very low, because there's no accounting for the soil carbon emissions. Whereas, okay, the burned area, it may not look very good, but it's still within, you know, the ballpark, generally speaking. So it means that basically, not having the soil combustion processes in these models means that we massively underestimate the carbon emissions of fires in at least the boreal world. And it's not only the boreal world, because, for example, a colleague of mine estimated the soil carbon emissions from the fires in France of 2022, which were unusually severe, which you can see on the left side there. An interesting thing about that was that not only were most of the emissions coming from the soil, so you see here the soil organic matter in the brown, light brown, and also some peat. But also it was igniting some kind of lignite material which was in the soil, and which was really smoldering for a very long time afterwards. And this caused a huge amount of residual emissions over a very long period of time. And this was estimated using quite a complex mix of flux towers, satellite returns that estimate the carbon monoxide, and some inversion modeling of the atmospheric circulation. So representing soil fires means we have to be able to represent vegetation, fire, and soil reasonably well in high carbon content soils appropriately. That means you need to have good vegetation, reasonable fire, reasonable representation of the soil processes in your model, and reasonable representation of the combustion of your soil. So in Orchidea, we have a branch that's basically for the permafrost that represents soil, permafrost, and boreal soil processes, which is integrated with the fire model and with the rest of the land surface model. And so the difference of this is that we try to explicitly represent the soil thermal transfer through the entire column, which means that if you look at the left-hand side, it's a little bit small, but we include things like snow insulation. So there's a multi-layer snow, which insulates the soil surface. There's a thermal transfer down to like almost 40 meters. So it allows like explicit transfer of calculation, let's say, of thermodynamic heat transfer through the column, and lots of hydrological transfers. And basically allows for the buildup of permafrost soil carbon in the long term. You don't have to look at all of this. This is just some complex hydrology stuff from my PhD. So to have relevant soil process representations, we need to have lots of other things for the high latitudes. For example, we know that soil carbon concentration influences the thermal diffusivity of soil, which influences then how warm it is, and therefore how much microbes can eat the carbon, which then influences whether or not there's carbon being emitted from the soil as a decomposition. Within this model as well, we now have a per vegetation type soil thermal energy balance, which basically says that for each overlying type of vegetation, there's a explicit calculation for the transfer of energy from the canopy through to the soil and down for each type of vegetation, which is much more accurate, especially for things like peat versus forest versus tundra in the boreal region. So that's useful. We have an explicit peat module, which allows for the creation of peat over 10-20,000 years of model run by essentially waterlogging the soil and creating new moss plant types. There's a type of soil called Yodoma, which is highly mineral rich, which is very important in the high latitudes and contains sort of around 400 petagrams of carbon, and contains also a lot of ice, which is very important for the thermal dynamics and representation of things like thaw, slump collapse, and so on, thermokarst. And finally, yes, we have also a module for pyrogenic or black carbon formation, which is quite important as well to the terrestrial carbon cycle, because it basically may allow for a large amount of the carbon that was affected by fire to actually remain on the terrestrial or aquatic worlds for a considerable amount of time before oxidation. So, for example, in rivers, the average age is about 14,000, 14C years. So, these things and all these considerations and being able to model them are quite important before we can even start talking about soil combustion modeling at a global scale. So, finally, to soil combustion. How might we, since this is not done yet, represent this in such a model? So there are inferential and explicit process-based methods. So inferential would be, going and taking field data of, like, say, burn depth or burn fraction or something similar of soil, and basically matching that against the conditions that preceded or post-dated a fire, climatologically, the behavior of the fire, and various other things like topography or vegetation and so on, and using machine learning to create a predictive statistical model. So this has been done a few times now. So yeah, this is from a guy called Dave Van Bies in I believe Amsterdam or Wageningen. So basically, to do this, it's basically what I said just now. They have field measurements, predictive variables. The predictive variables are made up of a large suite of different sources. They remove certain features, tune parameters, and basically eventually get to a statistical model after evaluating for uncertainties and Monte Carlo methods. And so, yeah, this is the output from that sort of method. So it's quite exhaustive and quite exhausting to build such a model, but it is once built, computationally quite cheap, reusable, and it does incorporate a lot of processes or variables rather. But on the other hand, there is not that much training data, and it doesn't really capture the kind of dynamics we may be interested in. Such as, for example, if a fire passes over soil in a boreal region, it might lower the active layer, which is the area that is not frozen, so that more soil at deeper depth is exposed to warmer temperatures, and warmer temperatures may allow for more microbial metabolization and therefore more CO2 emissions. So there's secondary impacts of fire, which a statistical model would not necessarily, at least not in this way, be able to capture. The other way would be through explicit process-based methods, but this is not yet developed. There are only some papers, which Professor Huang is one of those involved in such efforts, in which this is done at the laboratory scale, and they sort of decompose in-soil spread into two vectors, in a lateral and a vertical one, which lead to a global vector. And this is basically then modeled or represented or captured rather as a function of soil organic carbon content, or the inorganic carbon content, or the moisture content. But yeah, I mean, essentially it could be done with any suite of driving forces that may or may not change the outcome of soil combustion and spread, and therefore the total amount of soil consumed in a fire. Yeah, I mean, again, this is from this is the Guillermo Ryan lab, but basically they show that even like if you decompose your spread, your global spread here into lateral and vertical vectors, then the vectors themselves behave very, very differently. So with your lateral, i.e. your sideways spread, as your moisture content increases, the spread rate decreases. And this is changes also as a function of the inorganic carbon content, which is what IC means. So basically, the more organic your soil is, the more it'll spread. And then you can create these kind of three-dimensional functions for that. And also with the downward spread, and this is from Professor Huang here, your spread rate will also increase with actually this time it increases with moisture content, which is kind of counterintuitive. And the reason for that is, yes, when lateral spread is less than or equal to downward spread, local extinction begins. And this lateral spread is slowed down by increasing inorganic carbon and water content. The increase in these will cause faster relative downward spread and lead to overall extinction more quickly. So basically, yeah, as your vector spread direction in the soil increases in this way, you also get an increasing moisture content, which also then leads to extinction faster. So, I mean, none of this stuff is included in the models, but I sort of hope to show that there's kind of a way, which is this is basically what we've done already for a large number of processes on the Earth system, to incorporate this kind of lab scale experimentation at some point into global scale models. But obviously there's a large amount of experimentation that needs to be done before that's possible. So for explicit process-based methods, the pros are that, well, these give a dynamic response to the system. You can infer the dynamics that I was talking about earlier, such as soil heating, and other dynamics such as permafrost collapse and lake formation. And they can give us the total fire emissions from both combustion, microbial, and isothermal processes. The problem, obviously, is that this is computation expensive. There's a huge problem of spatial and temporal scaling, because a lot of these kind of processes are on tiny scales, both in time and space. And some conditions in the lab may not reflect the real world, maybe. Yeah. And also because, well, as you saw, the models are not themselves perfect to begin with. In fact, they're very flawed. And so you then have to sort of nudge empirical theory into this kind of clunky, big process-based system model. I'll just skip that. Yeah, and that's it. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, you just write in the chat or speak in the chat. I don't know how it works.
I use the chance to ask one question.
Sure.
So I see one of your slides talking about the Arctic fire satellite image. Seems like as going to the winter like this one. So if you are going to September, October, so the fire actually moving to even north, closer to the pole.
Mm-hmm.
In the summer, it's actually in the low altitude.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like counterintuitive to me.
Well, I think that the growing season is basically quite short the further north you go. So basically the buildup of litter and things like that necessary for a large-scale fire spread is really only towards the very tail end of the summer. I mean, I've actually been in that region here during the late summer in like end of September, and there was a lot of fire.
So it's something like you need accumulation of the
Fuel, yeah.
fuel to burn.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure why that's not the case. Oh no, that is very far north as well. Yeah. So yeah.
Yes. Any questions? Yeah, just speak on.
People online.
Yeah, for people.
I would like to have simple clarification. And I think the carbon cycle is from their study in the first work. And I want to know if we into a small scale forest, just like a park. We want to know the carbon emission from the wildfire, and in the real forest, maybe the forest compare with the leaves tree or the power tree, and also they will create the different humors and the different soil.
Mhm.
So can you or other items such as the slope or the water water table in the soil. So which model you think is better and can consider all of these items or as many as possible to use it in the fire carbon emission. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. I think it depends on the scale. Really, like, I mean, if you care about the carbon emissions from a park, then you'll use like a really small scale fire model, which tends to be much better. But they require loads of inputs that are very, very locally, and they're usually on sort of short time scales too. Checking the next 2 weeks or something. But if what we do is more sort of global, next 100 years sort of thing, in which case you would not use such a small model. Because they're really expensive to use a computation too. So even if you try to expand that, take the same model and use it for the whole world, you need inputs that don't exist. So you need a lot of input data, which we don't generally have. So I mean, for example, in this model, a lot of the inputs that we use actually come from much higher resolution than the model outputs. The model's output 0.1, 0.5 degree. But a lot of the inputs are derived from data 10 or 30 or 50 meters resolution. So that you can create appropriate representative algorithms or relationships between different components in the land.
Maybe I'll ask another question. Just for example, because I think different work using different scale. So standards people. Yes, so this looks quite big, the cell. So is this I mean, in the real analysis, did you use smaller cell or actually you use such a large scale?
Well, I think this isn't my work. This is from a guy in Amsterdam. But I think the idea, I think this is about 1 or 2 degree resolution.
Very large.
But I think, I mean, the whole point here was that they were just trying to make a typology, like classes of like types of fire across the broader world.
What typical scale do you use when you analyze the satellite? It's like
Well, normally, okay, so the analysis is typically at the native resolution of the satellite data.
10 kilometers.
No, much higher resolution than that.
Okay.
So like 15, like I was saying, 10, 30, 50, 100 meter.
That's a lot of data.
There's a lot of data, there's a lot of work, process it, but then, you know, these have to go back into something that's not capable of running at that resolution. In order to run a 100-meter resolution on a global model, we could take some years, I think, just to have single outputs.
So what about the WUI work? You mentioned some circle. How big is the resolution in that?
That's the same, it's 0.5 to 0.5 degree that, so this was, this stuff here.
0.5 degree, you mean?
Yeah, so this is
huge.
Yeah, so that's sort of 2,500 square kilometer grids.
So almost like a city size, town size.
Oh, it's bigger than that, I would say, yeah. So this analysis excluded urban areas. The point being that everything is based on roads, and since roads in urban areas are skewed, and also because this is geared towards modeling burned area. And even if you have fires in urban areas, they tend not to have a very large burned area. So we excluded the urban areas from this model implementation.
But you also need to know the urban area to know the WUI region.
Yeah, so there are data sets so at a grid like this, which give you the total fraction of the grid cell that is urban. So there's a lot of people who do, this kind of remote sensing with a class, whether it's urban or non-urban or agricultural.
You add a future, basically urban area, wildland, WUI region, something like that.
Not really. I actually remove fully. Basically we say that there's no roads where there's urban areas. And we say that we're actually only interested in what's happening in areas that are not urban. So it's not really WUI as such. It's kind of a different conception of it. It's more like, just like, it's more to represent the breakup of land, basically. So say you have in the Amazon, people are cutting down trees, but in order to get the trees out, they'll have to build a road.
Yes.
And it's more this kind of abstraction. So
you use a road to track human activities.
Yes, but also roads are known to be fire breaks. So this implementation is basically to try to represent both sides of the story and to see whether or not, we could reproduce observed dynamics and trends. So for example, in this figure on the right, we can see that in the deep Amazon, so the proper wet Amazon, building roads and going to the forest causes a lot of fire. In the Cerrado, which is this dry forest that's basically blue, building roads actually decrease the fire because it limits the size of the fire, or rather its spread. And so this mapped onto statistical trends of land breakup and fire activity at, as you say, this very coarse scale.
Yes. Yeah, and another question. So I'm also quite surprised to see French land also have a lot of peat fire emission. I think you showed one.
Yeah.
Like here.
Yeah.
So that's like
this that's called, it's like this northwest blue bit. That's called Brittany.
It has peatland there.
It has peatland, yeah. Quite a lot as well. But most of actually the emissions from that year were coming from down here because there's a big plantation forest down there. So
this is soil organic matter.
Soil organic matter is a light brown, yeah.
That's a lot.
And then this lignite stuff, which is kind of like a
carbon.
No, it's like a type of coal, basically.
Coal.
Yeah, it's like those sort of fragments of bits of coal in the soil. There was some old mining in this region.
Oh.
And this stuff is just all over the ground. And so they were able to decompose the emissions based on the flux towers.
So this lignite is kind of like near the old coal mine.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. This stuff is smoldering for a really, really, really long time.
Coal fire, underground coal fire.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other question from the chat box? Yeah. We can show it.
Oh, yeah.
So it's some question here. Lots of chat.
Okay, so Gao Tong, I noticed that as population density increase, the human ignition seems to increase at first, then decrease. Yeah, so this is a human ignition function that's based on some paper that was originally built into the Spitfire model, which we didn't develop. It was actually developed in Imperial or Reading, actually, some years ago by a lady who's now in Potsdam. But basically, it says, yes, that if you have at a low population density, you're more likely to have ignitions. And then you have a decreasing ignitions as the population density increases. It's basically saying that if you're in like a pristine environment, if one person appears, then they're likely to increase the ignition probability by a higher margin than the next 10 people are. And if you, or the next 1,000 people. So if you have 1,000 people, you know, and then you add one person, it doesn't make a big difference. Does that make sense?
So you have the law and orders to.
Well, exactly. It sort of implicitly includes things like suppression and law and social contract and so on. I mean, it's a very vague, hand-wavy function because.
Makes sense.
But yeah, it sort of vaguely makes sense.
Next one.
Blah, blah, blah. One time so far, large validation data set. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's my student.
Yeah. 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 So remote sensing, exactly. As far as I'm aware, it's not really capable of resolving burn depth or total combustion. There are sort of ways that they do it at the moment, which is kind of like if X amount of terrain is burned and there's Y type of soil and Z type of vegetation above it, and some other parameters relating to the fire behavior, then they do some factor and they say, well, you know, if there's this amount of CO2 from the vegetation, this amount of CO2 that comes from the soil. But these are just based essentially on a small number of field data. And so leading to your second question, well, it's a bit like the slides I showed at the end. What we need is sort of relationships between existing processes and variables within our soil model that are able to represent the spread and duration of fire through the soil column, which has been done, but you know it's not done for the same type of scale. So it's not necessarily valid as such, but that the approach is useful in principle, which is why I'm kind of here to speak to Professor Huang.
I think something maybe we can think about is what kind of data do you need? What kind of limitation or the fundamental correlation you need? If you let us know what do you need, maybe we can do some tests to give you that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's not the time to give you all the. I mean, the soil carbon module is quite complex, but the point essentially is that we explicitly model and represent dynamically, and we build the soil within the model over thousands and thousands of years. We have the hydrology, so we have, you know, soil moisture content, organic carbon content, alkalinity content, and you know, on top of that with the fire and so on. The idea is that because we have these variables produced by the model, if we can relate the variables that already exist to variables that are produced by the fire model, and relate those to results from laboratory experiments, then we can, you know, just map functions from one to the other. That's essentially the idea.
Yeah, so we need to collaborate more, actually.
thanks, Apostolos. Yeah, I've seen some of your work too. Yes, I've actually been in touch with Guillermo a couple of times, and yes, also with Stephen Sage. Yeah, and yes, we should exchange ideas. Totally agree. I think I also met PhD student at EGU, Dimitra, I think.
Any questions from you?
Yeah. So yeah,
we have one question.
Also, and it's so nice to see there's so much improvements have been done in the OPD. And I'm wondering that when we wondering the file MIP, so all the models there's a huge disagreement in capturing the file emissions and file area. I have seen a lot of modifications you have done in the soil module, and I'm wondering how about the vegetation module in OPD, especially the DGVM dynamic vegetation model. Have you ever considered those are vital part in improving the fires in the PL system? Thank you.
You're from CRS.
No, I'm just a new PhD student.
Oh.
Yeah, thanks. A good question. So I think to contextualize that for others in these kind of big land surface models, there are two ways to represent vegetation. You can either impose, give the model a map that says which type of vegetation is here or there, in what fraction in each grid cell, or you can build it up dynamically, which is what sorry, what's your name? Okay, well, Xinjing was referring to. So dynamically, you build up the vegetation on the basis purely of basically climate and soil and so on. So it's a kind of a very bottom-up theoretical approach. Actually, the DGVM, so the dynamic vegetation model in Orchidea, is not very good. So at the moment, we just impose the vegetation. But we are there are people in my group who are now trying to do things like drought cavitation. So drought leading to mortality of trees, and then the dead trees then being much more easy to burn. So that becomes fuel essentially. So there's a relevance there, but I don't work directly on the vegetation side at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's all we have.
Okay.
Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.